Four cities, four mayors, four approaches to climate change. The mayors of Boston, Paris, Freetown, Sierra Leone, and Quezon City, Philippines, all made the cut for Forbes' first sustainability leaders list. We have two of them here today, Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, mayor of Freetown, Sierra Leone's capital with a population of around 1.5 million people, and Joy Belmonte, mayor of Quezon City, the largest city in Metro Manila with a population of 3.2 million. Welcome, Mayor Yvonne and Mayor Joy. So both of you, I would like each of you to first just introduce yourself and tell us how long you've been mayor for and a little bit about your city.
My name is Joy Belmonte, and I am the mayor of Quezon City. Quezon City is one of 17 local government units in metropolitan Manila, and I've been mayor since 2019.
Fantastic. Mayor Yvonne.
Hi, my name is Yvonne Aki-Sawyer, and I'm the mayor of Freetown, the capital city of Sierra Leone. It's nestled between the Atlantic Ocean and a range of mountains, which means that in terms of growth, space is at a premium. And Freetown has experienced a phenomenal level of rural urban migration. So our population has more than trebled in the last 30 years, with a massive impact on the natural environment.
And that's interesting you mentioned that there's been such a migration. What impact has that had on climate change there?
So climate change is very circular. You know, it impacts and it creates impact. So one of the drivers of rural urban migration has been the climate crisis. As I speak to you today, there's flooding in many parts of the agricultural areas of the country, so outside of the city. But it's not just flooding. There are times when there isn't rain. So the negative impact on a society or a country where 60% of people living outside of the city are subsistence farmers means that when their crops fail, there's a tendency for people to migrate to the city, looking for better opportunities. That's really had a big impact. The migration started some years back, different factors. You know, there was a civil war, there were economic drivers, but in recent times, the impact of climate change has been very, very negative from the perspective of driving that increased population. And of course, when you have that sort of increase of population in the absence of land use planning and building permitting at the city level, you also then have negative impacts in the city, such as deforestation, which itself leads to more flooding, leads to more landslides. So it's a vicious cycle, and addressing those climate impacts have been a significant part of my policies as a mayor.
Did you realize that when you first became mayor 5-6 years ago? Was that on your mind at that point? Or did something happen over those couple of years that made you realize this was a big issue?
I ran on a ticket of climate. It wasn't articulated as such. My articulation and the clarity of mind I had was around the level of deforestation. And it was as we went through, you know, this process that one began to understand, you know, what was driving that deforestation. At least certainly part of the drivers. There are many other factors, but part of the drivers. So I came to office in 2018, less than 1 year after a devastating mudslide. We had a mudslide on the 14th of August, 2017, which claimed over 1,000 lives in about 3 minutes. So these were very, very much at the top of mind for me as I ran from office.
That's really interesting. Mayor Joy, have you seen similar things in Quezon City before we started officially talking? You mentioned typhoons there.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Because when Mayor Yvonne came to visit us in the Philippines, in Quezon City, particularly for the C40 conference, we had a typhoon. And right now we have another one, or we just had one. So here in Quezon City, as in the rest of the Philippines, we are among the most at-risk countries in the world. And in fact, the most recent risk atlas shows us to be at the top of the countries at risk. And here in our city, we feel everything in terms of the effects of climate change. And for example, just today, I had a meeting with a senator, and it's because we, the city, have already had a drainage master plan drawn up with the help of the University of the Philippines, because the volume of rain has just been getting more and more. The quantity has been getting more and more, that our pipes are no longer able to absorb the rain, and that's why the floods are just continuous and unable to subside. The water is just there, and that has impacted the lives of so many of our citizens, because our city is so heterogeneous. While we have the very wealthy, we also have the very poor, and the very poor are highly impacted by these effects of climate change. So when there are floods, they are unable to go to work, they are unable to go to school. Their houses are flooded until the second floor, if they have a second floor, or until the rooftops. And when there is a typhoon that is very strong, they are on the tops of their roofs waiting to be rescued. And that's something that has become a regular occurrence for us here in Quezon City. And that's just the typhoons. And just recently, we've been experiencing heat waves as well. And I would like to say that we are very much inspired by the work of Mayor Yvonne in Freetown. And she has actually been a pioneer in heat action planning. And we have learned a lot from her, and we are following her example. And we are also at the moment identifying a heat officer for Quezon City to be able to train with the help of the Asian Development Bank.
Wow, that's a terrifying combination of the extreme heat and the typhoons together. I knew you had typhoons, but I didn't realize they were coming with extreme heat. Do you feel like that's, gotten worse the past couple of years? I know there's heat even in New York. We've had terrible heat this summer. I was in Phoenix. It was like 115 degrees there, which was pretty much unbearable. Have you found that it's getting worse in Quezon City? And how do you even think about how to deal with something like that?
Yeah, well, with regards to heat, yes, because we are living in a tropical country, and so we're very used to heat. There are only two seasons in the Philippines, and that's the wet season and the dry season. And classes are normally held in the wet season, but because of the continuous rains, floods, and typhoons, we decided to move classes to include the summer months, so that they could avoid all the class suspensions, because the kids were being affected, their learning has been affected. But when we moved them to the summer months, then we started experiencing extreme heat. So the kids are also unable to study and concentrate on their lessons. So we've had to do a lot of class suspensions as well. So we're left in a situation where we don't actually know when to put classes now, because we have extreme weather conditions throughout the year. And so this is, yes, when you asked about heat, yes, this is something very new. This is not something we experienced before. We have never had to suspend anything in relation to heat before, because this is something we're very used to. But now it's become quite unbearable as well here in the tropics.
It's really horrifying to hear. So I guess for both of you, like, how do you think about this? I know that you've both in your respective cities put into effect many different policies to combat climate change at this point. Can you sort of talk about some of those and how you think about, trying to mitigate the impact of this on people there?
So just picking up on the heat conversation, because as Mayor Joyce said, 2 years ago, is it 3 now, we appointed our first chief heat officer. And we were really thrilled that the work that she's done has been recognized. And just last Friday, she was invited to the White House to participate in a program on extreme heat, because what is clear now, as Mayor Joy is explaining, is that heat, which is the silent killer, kills more people than any other climate impact, but it's not seen. But it's being felt so much more intensely that it can no longer be ignored. So it's coming up the importance scale in terms of climate initiatives. And, our chief heat officer's role is to make heat her focus. So we've developed a heat action plan. Both Mayor Joy and myself have climate action plans, which speak to our climate action generally across the board. But we've also now in Freetown done a specific heat action plan. And that has, as its beginning, really, an appreciation and understanding of what the data is saying, sort of what the temperature variations are, how heat waves are happening. We're also tropical. We also just have the wet and the dry. But the dry is becoming too dry and the wet is becoming too wet, and if you talk about sustainability and policies that enable us to support our residents not only to survive through these, but to still have, the hope of an improved quality of life, then we've got to be very deliberate. So with our heat action plans, you just asked, what are some of the things that we're doing? Well, one of the clear things for us is building in or sort of piggybacking off one of our key climate actions, and that's reforestation. Nature-based solution, planting trees. It sounds so simple, and yet the impact is so pervasive, from reducing heat because of the shade effect, to improving the quality of air, to acting as a carbon sink, to protecting waterways, to reducing the risk of landslides and flooding. A tree is perhaps one of the most effective instruments to address the climate crisis and to address heat. So in addition to our general reforestation program, which is called #Freetown the Tree Town, our initial target was to plant and monitor the growth of 1 million trees. We've now planted 1.2 million. As we speak, we are planting to get to that 1.2 number. And we've set ourselves a target now of 4 million by the end of 2028. But specifically in respect of heat, it's being targeted. It's making sure we identify heat islands. We're planting in areas which have been devoid of green cover. We're creating green corridors. So going beyond trees, we're creating shade covers, market shade covers, so women working in the open areas. We're doing heat alerts. Early warning systems are being developed now by our team. But we're also looking at insurance cover, because many of the most vulnerable, the poorest in our communities, are those who end up working outdoors in the sun all day long, and whose even their livelihood, if you think of a market woman who's selling vegetables, in the extreme heat, her source of livelihood, her vegetables can be destroyed from being out in the sun all day. What does she do? We're working with Climate Resilience for All, which is a women-focused, heat-focused NGO who've already instituted a heat insurance scheme for women in India. And we're looking to bring that to Freetown. Very simple. If the temperatures go above a particular level, there's a payout. And that is used by the women both to support their livelihoods, but also for health. Because as we know, in extreme heat, with water shortages, the impact on your kidneys, the risk of heat stroke, all of these are increased. So those are just a few things that we're doing in Freetown. And we're inspired also by Mayor Joy. If she's inspired by our heat action plan, we're inspired by her urban farming plans. So I'm gonna come ahead of you, Joy, because I love it so much. Farming, the joy of urban farming is the name of her interventions. And from a perspective of mitigating against climate impacts, supporting women, supporting livelihoods, there's a lot that we're also learning from Quezon City.
Right, yeah. Joy, you have to tell me about this, and that's a great intro to it.
Oh, thank you for that, Mayor Yvonne. So actually, 4 days together, we really learned a lot from each other. And I really was quite inspired by the actions that Mayor Yvonne is doing with regards to heat. They're a little bit more advanced than us, because I think they've been experiencing tremendous heat earlier than us. Ours started just this year. And so just like Freetown, we're also planning to have our own heat action plan and hiring a heat officer. And we're getting the training that we need for that within this year or early next year. But in relation to other interventions, well, like Mayor Yvonne said, we both have local climate change action plans. And this is, of course, required by our membership. We're both members, and Mayor Yvonne is the co-chair of C40 Cities. Our plans are both based on actual data, and we have targets. And in our particular plan in Quezon City, we are focused on decarbonization or reducing our emissions through four ways. Basically, one is through circular economy. The other is through promoting better transport or sustainable transport, better energy efficiency methods, renewable energy, and just creating green and open spaces. Now, so as Mayor Yvonne said, they started planting trees, and that inspired us. We also have a plan to plant 1 million trees by 2030. So Mayor Yvonne did it in 2 years. So she said, you can do it in 2 years. So now we got inspired to do it in 2 years. So we'll try to do that, Mayor Yvonne. So that's one. And we are also in the process of doubling the number of parks in our city from about 250. Our goal is to have about 500 by the end of my term, which is about 2028. And we're also trying to increase our open spaces by about 30% by that same time as well. And we're focusing on planting indigenous trees and fruit-bearing trees. And we have also just finished our biodiversity mapping. So we have a map now of biodiversity in our city, and we're trying to find ways to make sure that these are maintained and improved on. And with regards to farming, actually, this is something that started in 2010. This is an advocacy of mine. It had nothing to do with the environment. It really had everything to do with food security. And it was because I wanted to find a way to provide livelihoods for the very underprivileged in our city, as well as to provide food for those that are food insecure or hungry. And but it was really only in 2010 during the pandemic when we experienced true food insecurity because food was just not available to us because of the lockdowns. And so people just started planting on their own. And the government was there to support them and to provide an enabling environment so that their farms could thrive. And now Quezon City has 1,300 urban farms and urban gardens. And this has created 25,000 green jobs for our poorest of the poor, I would say, who did not have sources of income in the past or had very insecure sources of income. And now with their produce, this is good enough for their families and their communities. But when they have excess produce, we provide them with a space in our public markets where they can sell this produce. And I was also talking about, I remember now, the idle land tax. So this is a tax that is paid when your land is not productive, and everybody has to pay this. Now, if they're not making use of their land, but anyone who offers or volunteers the land for our urban farming program is exempted from paying idle land tax. So many middle class people who are land, have allowed their communities, local communities, wherein they live, to just cultivate their land, and either they get a share or they don't. They just allow the people who've been cultivating yet to have the vegetables for free. So this is a great way for us to be able to have some source of food security. Given the fact that we are in the middle of a climate crisis, so this provides some source of sustenance for our people, basically.
It's interesting, and it seems important to just point out that both of you have made these links, not just between climate change and health, but also this climate change and economy, climate change and food security, that climate change has so many different impacts on people and almost needs to be addressed in multiple different ways.
That's right. So with our, as I mentioned, in my second term, my first term, our plan was called #Transform Freetown. And we had 4 areas of focus: climate resilience, human development, healthy city, and urban mobility. And we sort of wove climate change into that. After winning the election last year, the new plan, or the building on the previous plan, is now articulated as Transform Freetown, Transforming Lives. And our target there is to create 120,000 decent jobs for women and youth. And those decent jobs are green jobs. So like you say, there's a natural connection, correlation between addressing the climate crisis and actually creating jobs that are sustainable. So for example, in addition to the jobs created through the afforestation project through Freetown, the Tree Town, we also have jobs being created through the circular economy work we're doing with liquid waste management. And again, this ties to to saving our trees. 82% of cooking fuel in Freetown is currently wood or wood-based, which means that even as you plant, others are cutting down, as it is the main source of fuel. So one of the things that we're really excited about is how we've built a wastewater treatment plant and developed technology to allow the fecal sludge that comes from that plant to be utilized as cooking fuel and create through briquettes. So they're odorless, they're long burning, they're high calorific value. We built the plant in 2021. We took 2 years to kind of come up with this system, test, and now we currently are producing 2,000 tons a week, but by the mid to end of October, we'll be producing 2,000 tons an hour. And one of the emails that I looked at this morning was with our team members reaching out to charcoal distributors to say, we'd like to have a meeting with you because we're looking to replace the charcoal with the briquettes. And so that's sustainability, both in terms of the trees, but also in terms of livelihood. And on transport, again, the economic productivity is impacted by transport, by how we get around. And the transport in the city has been a big source of emissions. Like Mayor Joy said, we have our climate action plans. They are data driven. So we have done our calculations and we know where our emissions come from. And we knew that 28% of our emissions in our city came from transport, from low occupancy, high polluting vehicles. So for the last 2 years, we've worked on a feasibility study for a cable car. And that study has now concluded positively. We have an end of mission program from the 7th to the 11th of October. We've got line of sight for funding, and that will, with the introduction of that public-private partnership, which is how the cable car will run, we will create jobs, direct jobs, but we'll also facilitate indirect jobs because we'll be cutting travel time from across the city from 2 hours to 15 minutes, which will really improve productivity whilst reducing pollution, improving air quality, having safer transport for women. So that the benefits of climate action are multiple. One of the biggest challenges towards the implementation of climate action is funding, but I'm sure we'll say more on that in a minute.
Yes, I was just thinking about funding and thinking about, for each of you, how do you go about both selling these policies to other legislators and to the public, and how do you go about getting the funding to put them into effect?
Well, in the case of Quezon City, what we did in the beginning was we declared a climate emergency way back in 2019. And this is a declaration made by the Quezon City Council. The City Council did this. And by making this official, we were able to now justify allocating a greater budget towards climate action and climate justice. And at the moment, I think our budget is up to 23%. These are everything related to environmental stewardship and climate action and mitigating and adaptation measures. And that's pretty high. So because of this, then we've been quite faithful in following up or at least carrying out the different plans in our local climate change action plan. And at the same time, we've been able to get some support, not huge amounts of support, but from various organizations, both international and local, to try to do pilots. So we have a lot of pilot studies going on. And I think the real challenge for us is scaling up when we see some success. And that's where we have some trouble because it's not as easy as it seems to apply for funding from multilateral development banks because the interest rates are still quite high, especially for developing countries such as ours. And this is where there's a real challenge when it comes to scaling up. But what we've done to try to address this is to try to get the private sector to support us. So for example, one of the things that we want to do is to get, let's say, I'd say like malls and other commercial establishments to try to adopt more energy efficient or practices or renewable energy So what we did was we came up with something called the Green Awards, and we made it sound so prestigious, that. So it's a long process to be able to get one of these awards. And when we gave them out to one of the developers here, because they had really some very good practices, despite the absence of a local ordinance. Of course, this local ordinance is going to be passed this year also, which is the Enhanced Green Building Ordinance. But while we're still doing that, the awards are an incentive for people to for establishments, business establishments, to adapt green practices. So when we did that, other developers said, "Oh, we also want that award." So then they started adapting green practices as well. Like they have zero waste programs, zero plastic programs, they have tree planting programs, they have urban farming programs, they have energy efficiency programs for their buildings, LED lights, solar panels. They started doing it themselves, even if the policy was not in place, just by incentivizing them. And in that way, at least somehow, we're able to get the private sector to buy into what we are doing. So in the absence of big time funding from from banks and other international agencies, we are trying to do as much as we can to make a difference and to cover up for the needs in terms of financing. But basically, most of it at the moment is still locally funded, and not even nationally funded, because, like I always say, the national government is not really very active. That's why for me and Mayor Yvonne, we're trying to campaign for more cities to be involved, in making a difference towards climate action in our countries, because change has to come from somewhere, and we think that the change has to come from the cities.
That's really interesting. I want to come back to that, but first, I want to hear from Mayor Yvonne on the same issue of funding and selling the policies.
So the finance is definitely a big challenge, and one of the things that I was constantly saying when I visited Quezon City just 2 weeks ago, actually, I was there. I was attending a C40 Inclusive Climate Action Regional Academy in my capacity as the co-chair. One of the things that we've talked about, one of the things that's my priority as a mayor, has been to raise the issue and try to solve the issue of insufficient funding coming to the cities for climate action. In the meantime, what do? In our case, we have a much smaller GDP as a country. We have a big challenge nationally and at the local level to actually have access to local resources. One of the things that I did, not climate related, but just in terms of developing the city from a resilience perspective, was to radically change our own process for raising property rates, for securing property rates, which enabled us to increase our potential revenue locally 7-fold. That's still a drop in the ocean, and is nothing near what we need to be able to address the scale of the climate crisis and the impacts that we're experiencing. So at the moment, our funding comes from 3 sources, principally. One is grant funding. So because we are a less developed country than even the Philippines, we are able to access grant funding from development institutions. And because we have the clarity of plans, it's not been easy, but it certainly has been possible for us to present with some clarity and specification what it is we're doing and to get support for that. So whether it's from the World Bank or from the EU, FCDO, we have been able to a degree secure, but it's, again, not enough. The private sector, very important. So what I've mentioned in terms of the cable car will certainly have, or potentially have, private sector funding, although we're now seeing the possibility of some grant funding there. We're very grateful, but there could also be some debt. So there will be, it's that blended finance. And of course, to a certain extent, our own source revenue. But one of the things that we're actively working on now is tapping into the carbon market. So with Freetown, the Tree Town, we've just signed recently with a carbon developer and are working through the whole process of, documenting our inventory and getting the certification to enable us to access that funding. We can't overemphasize, as 2 mayors in cities that have not contributed significantly to the climate crisis that we're in, we can't overemphasize the level of injustice that there is in the current climate crisis. Those who have contributed the least to climate breakdown are suffering the most from the impacts and have the least access to the resources required to support their communities. So that's something that we advocate for. Whether it's the creation of a green bank, which is something that's been muted, particularly for cities, whether it is a reform of the multilateral financial institutions so that there is more direct access for cities and what would you call it? A realignment of where the money's going, because currently less than 8% of climate funds go to the developing countries that are least responsible for creating the crisis that we're in. So in short, we make it work as best as we can. It means there are many gaps. These are gaps that need to be closed. And we continue to use our platforms to advocate for more funding to be directed to those most at risk. And that cannot, I can't stop, end this bit without mentioning the Loss and Damage Fund, which was launched at the last COP. In fact, it wasn't the last COP, it was the COP before last, and then was partly funded, but in a very sort of inadequate way at the last COP. This crisis is an urgent crisis that needs financial resources. It touches all of us differently, but it will touch all of us. And it's so critical that the finance flows become more effective. And to be more effective, more of it needs to go to cities and to cities in the developing world.
That's an important point. And do you see that changing? I mean, as you've been out there advocating for these changes, do you see movement on that?
I think so. I think it's very slow, but we are seeing multilateral banks. I mean, the World Bank, the African Development Bank, Asia Development Bank. I mean, Asia Development Bank is already there in terms of, engaging directly with cities. But there's more of an appreciation of that. It's certainly been championed by the UN Secretary General. He's been a big supporter of the cities movement, not just for climate, but also for the SDGs, a realization that we won't be able to achieve those without the increased involvement and intervention and implementation at city level. So I think the narrative is what we're seeing changing faster than the reality, but it has to start somewhere. So if the narrative begins to change and there's more acceptance, then we've got hope that we're going to be moving closer to seeing actual change in policies and infrastructure.
Really, really interesting. And I want to go back to a point that Mayor Joy had made about getting other cities on board. And I'm curious for both of your countries, what you're seeing in terms of getting other cities to declare a climate crisis or get on board with how important this is in making, similar changes, whether it's planting trees or doing other things within their local communities.
Well, when it comes to climate action, if you talk about climate change and climate action, sometimes it doesn't resonate with other leaders in our country. I don't know if I could speak for a lot of other cities, but definitely in the Philippines. It's because the reality here is that term limits are short. They're 3 years per term, and everybody always has to perform so much within the 3 years, and 1 year is a campaign year. So 2 years basically to perform. And climate action doesn't really win a lot of votes when you think about it, unless you break this down into its elements. So when we discuss climate action here in our city, where most of the people don't understand it, and where gut issues are the most important things. You have to talk about climate in terms of how it affects food security, or how it affects the air that we breathe, or how it affects our water, or how eventually it will affect the schooling of our children and the productivity of our workforce. So you have to really change the narrative to make it more understandable and more digestible for the people that we're serving, in order to make climate a pertinent and important issue for them to consider when they vote for their leaders. But otherwise, left with the correct terminologies, these are just way above their heads. And that's why many political leaders in our country just don't bother with it, because it just, unless you're an advocate, and in my case I am an advocate, and which makes me different from many other leaders that we have in this country. And I think that one of the solutions is for the national government actually to be more active in making this crucial in our country's agenda of governance, because then everybody will have to follow. But at the moment, it isn't that important yet in our country's agenda. Although there's a lot of talk, and there's a lot of the usual discussions, but they have not trickled down to us in the city level. So those of us who are active in this space have to pretty much do it on our own, and it's really quite hard to find partner cities to be as involved as we are. But again, when you break them down into individual parts, then you get more support, because they tend to want to support clean air, or they tend to want to support a good education. That means they have to consider climate when they do that. So I guess it'll eventually happen, but not at the pace that it should, given the crisis that we're faced with at the moment.
That makes sense. That makes sense. Mayor Yvonne, have you seen other cities in Sierra Leone sort of have similar, try to take similar action that you are?
I think our tree planting model is something that's catching on. We definitely have interest from other cities. And like Mayor Joy said, it's about joining the dots. It's about helping people to appreciate and understand that it's not the language, it's not the terminology, it's what's actually happening. And if you focus on the fact that they're experiencing, like as I said, there are floods this week. They're not in Freetown. There are floods in Pujang, there are floods in Koinadugu, there are floods in other parts of the country where I've got colleagues, mayors or chairpersons, as they're called, for rural areas, as heads of local councils. And being able to see that impact and link it to climate change is helpful, but it's also limited again by what we were talking about just a moment ago, the finance. When you are working in a terribly under-resourced environment and you've got such pressing needs on a day-to-day basis, it's often difficult to prioritize something which seems further away or sort of less relevant. And I think part of our job, and if I can put it that way, as advocates, Mayor Joy and myself as C40 mayors, we're sort of by de facto ambassadors of climate change, ambassadors of climate action. Part of what we seek to do in our conversations with others is to help join those dots, but joining the dots without providing the cash, doesn't necessarily take you across the line. And so I will continue to say, we are only going to be able to address this on a global scale when we all have hands on deck and are ready to move the resources to where they're going to make the most impact, where they're most needed, where there will be justice for those who are suffering without having been part of the cause.
That's a very, very important point, and I think especially important for our readers and viewers, many of whom are in the U.S. and aren't thinking that way and should be. I'm curious, as you look to other cities globally, we have 4 mayors who made the cut for this project. Only the 2 of you were able to be here, but I'm curious, as you look globally, are there other cities that you feel like are doing other things that you think you could be doing in your cities, or other things that inspire you at the local level elsewhere in the world?
Well, one of the great things about being part of this network of cities, the C40 cities, is that we get together quite often. Well, twice a year. Oh no, not sorry, once every 2 years as a whole, I think. And then now we've been divided into the global south and the global north. So we tend to we'll probably meet more often in with our respective regions. And the one that we were in with Mayor Yvonne 2 weeks ago was really for Southeast Asia, and Mayor Yvonne was our special guest of honor, being the co-chair for the Global South. Um, Wait, I forgot the question. I can go back to the question again.
I was asking if there were other cities or localities that you felt were doing things that you might be able to do in your city, or that you felt inspired by.
Yeah, so that was just the introduction. Then I was saying, yeah, we get together, and that's a very good opportunity for us to share best practices with one another. And before, when it was all focused on the global north, they're all really nice things, but were very difficult for us to replicate in our context. But now, when we kind of meet together with countries of the same socioeconomic level, same context, same geographical locations, same geopolitics, we're able to adapt certain or replicate certain practices. So, for example, with the Mayor Yvonne, it's the trees, right? I'm so excited about the 1 million trees, and she said, I think you're planning to do 4 million, right? Yeah,
4 million by
and then
2028.
by 2028, 4 million. And that's such an inspiration, because I never thought it could be done. But on the other hand, I'm quite inspired by what Mayor Sadiq Khan of London and Mayor Anne Hidalgo of Paris are doing, which is to create more low emission zones in their respective cities. So here in Quezon City, we're going to start that next year in 2025. We have a budget to identify and create some low emission zones, just to see if we can do that in our context. If it'll work, if there's going to be acceptability, we'll pilot, because I know that in Paris, for example, pollution has gone down by 40% because of what Mayor Anne Hidalgo had done. That's a big impact. And in the Philippines as well, we're trying to promote active mobility, active transport. And at the moment, we have already built about 180 kilometers of bike lanes, and the goal is to make our entire city bikeable, and that's 350 kilometers of bike lanes, and we intend to finish that by the end of my term in 2028. So but these things were copied also from the global north, so there were some things we learned from them as well, but a lot of the things they're doing are really beyond what we can afford, and they're nice to have, and eventually there's something that we can dream about, but then we have to be more realistic. So we get a lot of better ideas from similar countries. So in Medellin, I just wanted to bring that up, because the mayor there is amazing. And what he did was he was able to bring down the temperatures in his city just by creating green corridors. And I think that's very doable in Quezon City, and probably also in Freetown. So that's something we're also trying to do next year. Create more green corridors, pedestrianization, and just really planting more trees. I think that's just what Mayor Yvonne said, but to do them in walkable spaces, in pedestrianized walkways, just make them very walkable, just entice people to actually walk in a city like mine, which is considered a city that is patterned after an American city, which is where people just drive and not walk. So that's something we're trying to do as well.
And similarly, we're really inspired by other cities. And the point that Mayor Joy made is a very valid one. It's harder to replicate interventions in cities that have budgets which are bigger than 3 times your country's budget. So it's, but something like the urban farming, I was so inspired. We were doing urban farming in Freetown. We had it on a much smaller scale. And I think what I was really taken by was the creativity that's been utilized in Quezon City. I went to a police station, what's it called, Mayor Joy? A police academy.
It's the Green Police Camp.
Yes. And in the where they used to park their cars is now planted. It's now a garden, and just along the walkway, an area of pavement was just converted into gardens. And I think the creativity of literally having the urban farms all over, everywhere, is something that we're taking away and connecting with Mayor Joy's team to work on. Similarly with the cable car, this was a Medellin intervention initially. It was the first one was done, I think, in 2011. And I met the then mayor, who's now the governor, in 2019. And we've worked with them in building our cable car intervention. So sharing ideas, learning from others, being inspired by others is certainly part of the climate, are one of the benefits of C40. But I mean, I think going beyond C40, it's, we learn, we copy. There's no point reinventing the wheel. This is about, getting things done, not being the first to do them. So, I think there's a lot to be learned from others. And we sometimes just have to contextualize, because we can't necessarily afford to do it the way others do it, but there's still something that we can take away.
That makes sense. We are nearing the end of an hour. I don't want to keep you all over, but are there any last things that we should have touched on, things that are important for us to think about either of your cities, or last thoughts on climate change before we let you go and start or end your days?
Well, one thing that came to mind that I had wanted to say and I hadn't gotten an opportunity to, and I think it's something that Mayor Joy has done as well, is we streamlined climate into the local council. So in 2021, we passed a resolution in our council to create a climate change department and a climate action department and a climate action committee. So that meant it became part of the life of council. It wouldn't just be a Mayor Aki Sawyer thing, but it'd be something that would always be there. And it also means that when it comes to our own budgeting as a council, we're able to then bring our climate action plan. And even if it can't be fully resourced, you're bringing it into the development, the budgeting of the council. And that's something that I feel is an important point. Because climate action shouldn't be seen as an add-on. It shouldn't be seen as this thing you think about every so often. It really needs to be incorporated into the way that we do governance, because it touches every aspect of our lives now.
So in my case, I guess just to touch on what Mayor Yvonne said about governance, it's really very important the way you govern your climate action plan, because without the participation of the communities, your plan will not succeed. And although our action plan is, it's founded on the Paris Agreement, the SDGs, still the top down and the bottom up approach really has to be stressed, that if the people don't buy into your policies, your plans, your programs, you will not succeed. So in our city, we have about 5,000 accredited civil society organizations representing 23 different sectors, many of them marginalized, many of them vulnerable, who are working with us to make sure that our climate action plans are accepted and are successful on the ground, because grassroots action is really the best form of action.
That's a great thought. Mayor Yvonne, you were going to say something.
I'm just going to say absolutely spot on, because community has to be at the heart of what you do. In any kind of change management, in any kind of successful movement from a government perspective, a governance perspective, you've got to have that ownership, you've got to have that buy-in. And I think, one of the things about Freetown, the tree town, that has made it interesting for Mayor Joy and for others is the fact that it's community owned, that we don't just plant trees, we grow trees, that every tree has a grower. And they monitor the growth of those trees. The trees are uploaded onto a digital platform. And so we're able to have the community be at the heart of it. People don't come in and plant. It's done by the community, and it creates jobs as well. So yeah, I think that's a really, really significant point. Nothing for me without me, no matter what area of action, what climate intervention you're doing, if the people don't buy into it, it's not going to be sustainable.
That is a great note to end on. That's such an important point. And thank you both, Mayor Yvonne, Mayor Joy. I really appreciate you being here and talking about climate change.
Thank you, Amy.